So before we officially begin, I have a request. Joyce is out sick today. She texted she was worried because the retirees are here. Normally it wouldn't be a problem. I'd stay till they go and lock up. However, I have 12:30, 1:45, and 3 o'clock communion visits today. So would somebody be willing to hang around and answer the phone and make sure the door's locked and the lights are out after retirees have finished? I don't know, 2 o'clock, 3 or 2 or something, I don't know. We'd have to, I don't know. Okay, all right, thank you. We could just, pop the lock and tell them, it'll lock behind you when you go out. That would be, I'm gonna swing by anyway. I'm coming back here at probably closer to 4, so I'll make sure the place is okay, but, yeah. Okay, and I'll be scooting out of lunch real quick today because of all of that. So, here we go, part 2. And I'm gonna go get the video started. If you're in a good spot, if it wasn't too small to see, you can stay where you are, otherwise you can move.
The Gospel according to Matthew. In the first video, we saw how Matthew introduced Jesus as the Messiah from the line of David, and as a new authoritative teacher like Moses, and also as Emmanuel, which in Hebrew means God with us. After Jesus announced and taught about the arrival of God's kingdom, and after he brought the kingdom into day-to-day life among the people of Israel, we saw that Jesus was accepted by many, but rejected by others, especially Israel's religious leaders, the Pharisees. And so the big question is, how is this conflict between Jesus and Israel's leaders going to play itself out? The next large section, chapters 14 through 20, explore all the different expectations people have about the Messiah. So Jesus keeps healing sick people, and twice he even miraculously provides food for these huge crowds in the desert. One is made up of Jewish people, and the other is a non-Jewish crowd. And this sign, it's very similar to what Moses did for Israel in the wilderness. And so all these people are excited about Jesus. They think he's the great prophet and the Messiah, but not the religious leaders. Their view of the Messiah is built on passages like Psalm 2 or Daniel chapter 2 about a victorious Messiah who's going to deliver Israel and defeat the pagan oppressors. And from their point of view, Jesus, he's a false teacher. He's making blasphemous claims about himself. And so there are stories here about them increasing their opposition, hatching a plan to kill him. And so in response, Jesus, he withdraws. And he begins teaching his closest disciples what it means for him to be Israel's Messiah, because it is not what anybody expects. So Jesus asks his disciples, chapter 16, he says, "Who do you all say that I am?" And Peter comes up with the right answer, it seems. He says, "Well, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God." But then it becomes clear that Peter's thinking about a king who's going to reign victoriously through military power. And Jesus challenges Peter, saying that, yes, I am going to become king, but through a different way. And so Jesus starts to teach on themes from the prophet Isaiah, who said that the Messianic king would suffer and die for the sins of his own people. And so Jesus, he was positioning himself as a Messianic king who reigns by becoming a servant, and who would lay down his life for Israel and the nations. Well, Peter and the disciples, they mostly just don't get it. And so Jesus enters into the fourth block of teaching, followed by a series of teachings after that. And these are all about the upside-down nature of Jesus' messianic kingdom, which turns upside down all of our value systems. So in the community of the servant king, you gain honor by serving others. And instead of getting revenge, you forgive and do good to your enemies. And in Jesus' kingdom, you gain true wealth by giving your wealth away to the poor. To follow the servant Messiah, you must become a servant yourself. In the next section, we watch the two kingdoms clash, Jesus' kingdom and that of Israel's leader. Jesus comes to Jerusalem for Passover riding in on a donkey, and the crowds are hailing him as the Messiah. And Jesus immediately marches into the courtyard of the temple, and he creates this huge disruption that brings the daily sacrifices to a halt. His actions speak louder than words here. As Israel's king, Jesus was asserting his royal authority over the temple, the place where God and Israel met together. And in Jesus' view, the temple was compromised by the hypocrisy of Israel's leaders. And so here he's challenging their authority, and naturally, they're deeply offended. And so they try to trap Jesus and shame him in public debate, and they fail. So they end up just determining to have him killed. In response, Jesus delivers his final block of teaching. He first offers this passionate critique of the Pharisees and their hypocrisy, and then he weeps over Jerusalem and its rejection of God and his kingdom. Then Jesus withdraws with the disciples, and he starts telling them what's going to happen. He's going to be executed by these leaders, but in doing so, they're going to create their own demise, because instead of accepting Jesus' way of the peaceful kingdom, they're going to take the road of revolt against Rome, and so Jerusalem and its temple are going to be destroyed. But, Jesus says, that is not the end of the story. He's going to be vindicated after his death by his resurrection, and one day he'll return and set up his kingdom over all nations. And so in the meanwhile, the disciples need to stay alert and stay committed to just announcing Jesus and his kingdom and spreading the good news. And so with all of that ringing in the disciples' ears, the story comes to its climax. That night, Jesus takes the disciples aside and he celebrates a Passover meal with them. The Passover retells the story of Israel's rescue from slavery through the death of the Passover lamb. And then Jesus takes the bread and the wine from this meal as new symbols, showing that his coming death would be a sacrifice that would redeem his people from slavery to sin and evil. After the meal, Jesus is arrested. He's put on trial before the Sanhedrin, a council of Jewish leaders. And they reject his claim to be the Messiah. They charge him with blasphemy against God. Then Jesus is brought before the Roman governor, Pilate. And he thinks Jesus is innocent. But he gives in to the pressure from the Jewish leaders, and he sentences Jesus to death by crucifixion. So Jesus is led away by Roman soldiers and crucified. Now, you'll notice right here in this section that just like Matthew did in the opening chapters, he increases the number of references to the Old Testament. He's trying to show that Jesus' death was not a tragedy or a failure. Rather, it was the surprising fulfillment of all of the old prophetic promises. Jesus came as the servant Messiah, spoken of by Isaiah. He was rejected by his own people, but instead of judging them, he is judged on their behalf, bearing the consequences of their sin. So the crucifixion scene, it comes to a close, and Jesus' body is placed in a tomb. But the book ends with a surprising twist, the last chapter. The disciples, they discover on Sunday morning that Jesus' tomb is empty. And then all of a sudden people start seeing Jesus alive from the dead. And the book concludes with the risen Jesus giving a final teaching called the Great Commission. Jesus says that he is now the true king of the world. And so he sends his disciples out to all nations with the good news that Jesus is Lord and that anyone can join his kingdom by being baptized and by following his teachings. And echoing all the way back to his name, Emmanuel, God with us, from chapter 1, Jesus' last words in the book to his disciples are, I will be with you. It's a promise of Jesus' presence until the day he finally returns. And that's the gospel according to Matthew.
So you get all that. So I'm going to put this in the back. Here's a complete printout of the diagram, if that's of use to you. I'll put it on the back pew. You can take it, the back chair, take it if you'd like at the end of the session. So it has at the bottom of the handout the link to the website for all of the videos. So if whatever, like 1 Corinthians come January, if you start that series, go there and get yourself a survey so you'll kind of be primed for what happens in that discussion. Questions about what you saw before we dive into the questions you sent me? Overwhelming, I guess. It blows my mind to think they've done that kind of work for all the books of the Bible. Anyway, I don't know how the technology is, but it was awesome. Okay, well, so we'll dive into the things that came this week. I took this to mean the whole basically second half of the book. Jesus with attitude, I like that. No making peace with the scribes, the Pharisees, nor attempt at forgiveness for their ignorance, also aiming his disdain at the disciples. And the question that it leads to is, does this add fuel to the fire of anti-Semitism? We'll get to that last part in a minute. Jesus wrestles with the Pharisees, and the scribes are kind of named in the same phrases often, scribes and the Pharisees. The scribes, of course, we know about the Ten Commandments, but that's not all the commandments in the Hebrew Scriptures. Do you happen to remember the number of total commandments in the Hebrew Scriptures? 613. Yeah. If you go through all 5 books of Moses, you can tally up 613. Will they possibly cover every situation you'll ever face? No. The oral tradition that develops out of those 613 was attempted to be written down by the scribes or kept track of. So they were walking around. Of course, they had their scrolls of the Matthew, wrong Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They had those scrolls that they could point to things. But they also were carrying around this body of oral tradition to help interpret what it means to keep the Sabbath, for example. What if you're walking along and a stone wall has fallen on somebody on the Sabbath? You're not supposed to work. You're allowed, part of this oral tradition suggests, you're allowed to stop and see if they're alive. If they're alive, you can remove the stones because you're saving a life, and you can do that on the Sabbath. If the body's dead, you got to wait till Monday, or till Sunday, the next day, because that's work to unbury a dead body. And so on and so on and so on. So, and the Pharisees, they get the bad rap, probably the worst rap in the Gospels, and they deserve it, but their heart was in the right place, because long before George Santayana ever said, those who fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat it, they understood that. They looked back at the history and said, what happened to the northern 10 tribes? Assyria wiped them out. Why? They didn't keep Torah. What happened to our ancestors that were dragged off to Babylon? Why? Because they didn't keep Torah. Why did we get invaded by this nasty king Antiochus, this Greek dude who slaughtered pigs on the altar in Jerusalem? Why? Because we didn't keep Torah. Why are the Romans here? We're not keeping Torah. Keep Torah, and it will be okay. And trouble is, as I say, legalism without a heart. They lost the spirit of the text, focusing on the letter of the text, and became just oppressive, and Jesus went up against that all the time. So he was against that kind of legalism. Yes. Jesus talked to the crowds about the Pharisees, saying, see, do as they say, not as they do, because he saw them, in addition to wanting to make sure everybody else kept the law to the letter, he accused them of being hypocrites, of not doing what they even preached themselves. Exactly right. Then comes the Sadducees, and they were often allied with the chief priests, because they were kind of in cahoots with the Roman authorities, so that they could keep their position. But the Sadducees were the Bible fundamentalists of the Hebrew people. They only would allow doctrines, if you will, to be drawn from the first 5 books of the Bible. By the time of Jesus, there were many more than 5 books. We had all the prophets, all the Psalms, and by the time of Jesus, the Hebrew scriptures were pretty much complete, except they hadn't officially been designated as such. So the Pharisees were cool with all of Scripture. They quoted the prophets and so on. The Pharisees even had a lively hope in the resurrection. Somebody once said, if a Pharisee had run into Jesus on Easter morning, he might have said, where's everybody else? If the resurrection's here, where's everybody else? Sadducees, not. Because they claimed they could not find evidence of the resurrection anywhere in those first 5 books. Whereas if you read Job, I know that my Redeemer lives and I will see him again in my flesh and so on, and other places in Scripture, but not in the first 5 books, they said. So, but Jesus demolished that argument when he quoted from the book of Genesis, the book of Exodus. When Moses was met by God in that burning bush, how does God introduce God's self? I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am the God of, not I used to be because they're dead now, I am their God. He proves from Exodus that God is the God of the living, and in that way proves resurrection. So he demolishes their fundamentalism and their, anyway. Then there's the disciples, and these poor dudes almost never really get it. They clearly do get it because they do start to go off into the world and share the good news. But in the Gospels, it's still an open question whether there's going to be a book of Acts and the expansion of the ministry. But the key is, and I think the video was kind of getting at this, you don't know Jesus as Messiah until you see him crucified and risen. So until you get to that point, to the degree that the Gospels, especially the Gospel of Matthew, is like a biography, a narrative of Jesus' life, they can't possibly know who he really is, especially if they're leaning into that other strand of messianic hope for the sword guy. They can't see it at all. Nobody wants to see the suffering servant, nobody, except Jesus. So, and even then, the quote in Matthew 8:28, when Jesus finally meets the disciples as the risen Christ on the mountain before the Great Commission, it says the disciples worshiped him, but some doubted. So even then, seeing him raised from the dead, there's still, and the word doubt, at least in Greek, sort of suggests a wrestling, internal wrestling. Could this be? Maybe it's not. Am I seeing something? I don't know. So there's even questions at that point. I wanted to bring this quote from Luther in because it sort of applies here, I think. Mary's time came as they were drawing near, and Joseph sought room for them in the inn, but there was no room in the inn. Of course there was. There was all the room in the inn, but nobody would give up a room. Shame on you, wretched Bethlehem. You should have been burned with brimstone. It gets better. And don't let you, this is part of Luther's sermon, probably a Christmas sermon. Don't let you people in this congregation think you'd have done any better. If you were there, I can just hear you say, oh, we would have loved to take care of baby Jesus. We would have washed his diapers. No, you wouldn't. If you'd been there, you wouldn't have done a bit better. And if you think you would, why don't you do it for your neighbor in your midst who is Christ among you? Ooh, now there's some preaching, right? So even in Luther's time, he accused people of not really seeing Jesus for who he really is. And then the last part of that question was, does all of this antipathy over against the Jewish leaders, is that the roots of anti-Semitism? And we got to be careful about reading a term back into first century Palestine or the Holy Land. Suffice it to say, and we're going to get more into this later in the discussion because another question really raises this powerfully. But Matthew is not really indicting the Jews as a community, as a people en masse. The way he put the Jesus story together, he sees Jesus opposing these religious leaders who refuse to see him for who he is refused to honor Torah the way it was intended to be followed by the heart and so on. So, and you can find proof texts to support anti-Semitism anywhere you want to look, I suppose. We're going to get into that towards the end, because yes, they do use that phrase, but differently in terms of quantity. Oh, sure, sure. Is there? Right, again, Matthew's not against the Jews. He was one himself. He recognized Jesus. I mean, a lot of people are shocked to hear Jesus was a Jew. What? I thought he was the first Christian. No, he wasn't. So I think that we'll uncover more of this as we get towards the end. Would like clarification of Matthew 18:18. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And I was so glad to get this question, because it falls within the larger passage, out of which, not that verse, but another verse is one of the most commonly quoted out of context verses that I've ever heard. So we'll get to that. That particular passage has to do with the one that was on the wall, when sin takes place within the body of Christ, within the church. So Jesus describes what's supposed to happen. If somebody sins against you, one-on-one, point out the fault. And if they confess, you forgive, we're done. If they don't, take a couple of witnesses. I made an appointment to see the bishop. I had never met him in person the whole time I've been here. I thought, well, before I go, I got to at least meet who I'm working for, who's actually the pastor of this church. If I was called, I'd be your pastor, but since I'm an interim, he's your pastor. I'm just working for him. So when I made the appointment, he wanted to know, is there trouble brewing? Because if there was, he was going to bring a couple of people to sit in on the meeting. I said, it's all good. Well, there's no problem here. I just wanted to say thank you, and that's about it. So if you aren't listened to, take one or two others as witnesses. If they say, okay, we're good, then we're done. But if you're not, then tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen to even to the church, then you take that bad apple and you exclude them from the community. Out they go. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you permit, forbid and permit, bind and loose, will be loosed in heaven. And the rest of the context here. Again, I tell you, if you agree on earth about anything, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there in the midst of them. I've done this. You've all done this. I can remember all the way back to when I was an intern. One girl shows up for high school Bible study. I said, you know what it says in the Bible? Where 2 or 3 are gathered, and we're 2, we're good to go. I don't think we're abusing the passage, but that's not what Jesus was talking about. He was talking about the very difficult decision to exclude somebody from the fellowship of the church because they're unrepentant. You may or may not know this, but in Faith Lutheran Church Constitution, Chapter 15, Article 1, denial of the Christian faith as described in this Constitution, conduct grossly unbecoming a member of the Church of Christ, or persistent troublemaking in this congregation are sufficient cause for discipline of a member, Prior to disciplinary action, reconciliation will be attempted following Matthew 18:15 through 17. So that's not, all of our ELCA churches have that in their constitution. So if you get a problem, you go right to that, right to this. And if you make that tough decision, then know that Jesus is there affirming it. Another good one came. So the question is, does the verse I'm about to show you acknowledge differing forms of sexuality that are hot-button topics in our own time? The passage is this: for there are eunuchs who have been so from birth. There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. There are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. Again, it's tricky to try and read into the first century issues with which we wrestle today about gender identity and fluidity and all the terms that fly around about this. The context of this passage is Jesus talking about divorce. And if you divorce and you remarry, you're committing adultery. And so the disciples ask, well, wouldn't it be wise not to marry? If you run the risk, little did they know how pertinent that would be to the 21st century. And so when they asked Jesus, wouldn't it be better not to marry, that's where Jesus says this. So what is that all about? Well, in the Hebrew tradition, there were the categories of so-called eunuchs that were described sometimes with idioms. What did I do with my note? Oh, I think I put them on the screen. That's why they're not in my notes. So the first phrase that he mentions, which were so born from their mother's womb, the Jews called eunuchs of the sun, which meant that when they came to light, it was discovered that probably biologically speaking, they weren't capable of reproduction. Okay, something was missing, and this happens. Okay, that was the first category. The second category is eunuchs by the hands of men. Well, I've been watching Game of Thrones. I know what that's about. Ouch. Sometimes they punish people that way. Sometimes, apparently, it also says, have made themselves eunuchs. That one's hard to picture. And then those who are, I keep clicking, there's nothing up there, for the sake of the kingdom. So those four together suggest that the emphasis is not on sexual identity as much as it is whether a person, either because of birth or because of their own sense, have decided marriage is not appropriate or possible. I don't think, it might be a text that people go to in this discussion about non-binary, fluid gender identity and all those things, but I'm not sure that it really applies. It has more to do with the context of wrestling with whether one should be married, and Jesus pointing out there are reasons why people shouldn't or choose not to. I've done studies with congregations before on spiritual gifts, and the list I use is like 27 long, and one of the gifts of the spiritual gifts is celibacy, which is not something the church ever should have imposed on clergy or anybody, but rather it should be a gift that you discover somehow for yourself. And if that's your spiritual gift, then some of this language might apply to you in terms of how you understand yourself, but it's not not to be a forced decision. Did we do justice to that one? Yeah, okay. That was a tough one. So there's a story in chapter 22 about a wedding feast where, as I recall, the initial guests refused because they were just too busy to come to the feast for the king's son, I think it was. So they went out and beat the bushes and brought in the hoi polloi from outside. And everybody was given a wedding garment. And the question is, what's the importance of these wedding clothes? And it served a couple of functions, but number one, it was show-off time for the king. The king would have this wardrobe beyond imagination, full of garments, and so when you came in to be a part of the feast, you put on one of the king's garments as a way of the king showing off their wealth and prosperity. So there's that. But it served as, what I think of is when we have a funeral and we have the pall over the casket, you might be in a cardboard box under there, you might be in a platinum and diamond encrusted casket, but in here we're all the same. The story goes on to say one was in the midst of the room without a garment and wasn't treated well. The moral of the story there is, if our king is God, and in baptism we have been clothed with Christ, that's the only way we're going to be deemed righteous. If you think you can get in with your own clothes, sorry. I used to do this exercise for First Communion class when I was talking about what happens in baptism and communion. I get out a piece of paper and I have my math test, which has half of them wrong, so I get an F, right? But then I put out my life test based on the Ten Commandments. I got them at least half wrong. I get an F on my life test. Then I bring out a third piece of paper. It's Jesus' life test. Guess what? He got them all right. I take his and put it on top of mine and roll them together so that I'm wrapped up in his righteousness. That's what the garment is in that story. And I don't dare try to make an appearance at the gates dressed in my own righteousness, because then I'm out. Yeah, back to Pharisees, Sadducees, and so on. Yes. So this wasn't so much a question as an observation. Chapter 24 has a list of, and I think he mentioned this in Jesus' last series of teachings. Here's a summary of what Jesus answers when the disciples say, "Tell us what the signs of your coming and the end of the age are going to be." Well, there's going to be those coming saying, I'm the Messiah, and they'll lead you astray. There's going to be wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation. There's going to be famines and earthquakes. You followers of mine are going to be tortured and put to death, hated by all nations because of me. Many are going to fall away and betray one another and hate one another. False prophets, lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. I don't know, I'm sure he knew when he said that particular line how powerful that was going to play in books like the Gospel of Mark and the book of Revelation, which are all about, folks, if your faith goes cold and you stop telling the story, it's over. So get out there. The desolating sacrilege standing in the holy place. That's the weirdest line in this whole thing. It's a phrase that comes out of Daniel, which in Daniel is referring to the slaughter of pigs by that Greek king in Jerusalem's altar. How Jesus means it in this particular passage is probably another hour. Great suffering, false messiahs and false prophets. The sun will be darkened, the moon not give its light, stars will fall from heaven. The sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. And then the Son of Man will come in the clouds and send his angels with the trumpets and gather everyone. 2 will be left in the field, 1 will be taken, 1 will be left. 2 women will be grinding, and 1 will be taken, and 1 will be left. A lot of people point at that as the rapture passage, and it's just exactly backwards. The ones that are taken are the ones that are destroyed. It all relates back to the story of Noah, which is the context for that imagery. In Noah, the bunch got into the ark, the rest were taken. So don't let people twist that around. So there's the whole chapter. But you'll notice this is what I do with this chapter. This is not what you have to do with this chapter. But you can see there's 3 verses highlighted there. And the first one that I've highlighted is this phrase where he says, "This generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place." What do you make of that? Jesus lived roughly BC 6 to AD 30. He was talking to people who were probably born after him. The disciples were probably, if he was 30 when he started his ministry, his disciples may have been 15-year-olds, so he might have been half a generation older than them. And the tradition has John writing in prison the book of Revelation towards the end of the 1st century as a really old man. But by the 2nd century, everybody who was hearing him speak was dead. Did all that happen? Well, here are some of the words Jesus uses when he uses that phrase, "this generation." Evil, adulterous, faithless, perverse, sinful, condemned, guilty. Any of those words still apply? That is why my conclusion is there's only one generation. It's humanity, and we're part of that generation. That's John's interpretation. The next verse that got my attention, and about that day and hour no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Why does that keep getting ignored by all these couple of centuries worth, at least, of prophets who believe, starting with somebody named Miller, I think back in the 1800s, right up until, I don't remember, it was just not that long ago, there were big billboards and stuff, that he's coming on this date. Some, I think pastors in Korea got their churches to sign all their mortgages over to him and stuff, saying this is the date. Well, guess what? We're still here. Or else the rapture happened and it only took like 3 people and the rest of us are left behind. I don't know. So that one's important to me, as if to say, all the rest of this doesn't matter. The Son doesn't even know. So let's just relax and let God take care of it.
What amazes me is that back in the early 60s, mid-60s, and that there was so much talk about, look at all the signs, it's the end of the world is coming, and I keep thinking, why are we not hearing that all the time now? Seems like things are worse now and more in line with how we...
Yeah. The late, great Planet Earth, Hal Lindsey, and all the Left Behind books, and all that has just sucked all that up. But yeah. And that's a good point. Maybe they're wrong too many times. Yeah, some of those people learn to be quiet. But having said all that, just about the last words of the passage are, be ready. Because Christ's next coming for me will probably happen before the big one, shall we say. You know what I'm saying? And so I've got to be ready. And I think there's a balance between taking leave of you this afternoon as if it's the last time I'm going to ever see you with tears and so on, and pretending like we're all going to live forever. There's a place in the middle for cherishing every time we get to be together and living in the moment, all that stuff, and not being maudlin about it or whatever. But on the other side, not pretending we live forever, which is harder and harder to do the older you get.
It's an odd thing.
So this was an interesting question. There is no Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do in Matthew. Matthew, I think, only has 2 words from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And I'm forgetting the other one. But is that reinforcing how nasty the Jews were? To answer that, one way of answering that is to look at the 4 different Gospels and how they, when they were written and what was going on when they were written. So Mark was probably written somewhere between 65 and 70, okay? And 70 is an important date because that's the date of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans. So if Pentecost is somewhere around 33, we've got a whole generation of people following Jesus who were able to find refuge, shall we say, in the temple and symbolically under the umbrella of Judaism. The Romans, as they flung their empire all over in every direction, could not unite it by way of language. It was too big. But one of the tricks they thought they could pull off was uniting it by religion. And so in virtually all the rest of the ancient world, adding one more god to the pantheon of gods, no problem. I mean, it's estimated that when Paul went to Athens, it's talked about in Acts chapter 16, I think, he mentions this altar to an unknown god. And somebody estimates that at that time there were altars to 600 different gods in Athens. What's one more? No problem. Cover our bases. Put one more in Rome. It's fine with us. So they would come to take the census and get their head tax or whatever it was. They'd put up a little altar with incense, and you would walk up and you would drop a pinch of incense on the altar, and as it burned up, you'd say, "Caesar is Lord." Okay. However, they knew from experience they couldn't pull that off in Israel. Because these guys were crazy about being monotheistic. There's only one God. So they had this sort of protective umbrella of benign neglect from the Romans. And the Christians were able to live under that for a while. But when the temple was gone, that's when things started to go downhill. Now, Matthew and Luke probably had Mark's version at their hand, and maybe another document. If you really dig into this, you'll hear it called Q, which is the short for the German word Quelle, which is source. There may have been another document that nobody's ever found that Matthew and Luke used to pull more Jesus stories out to make their versions. Okay. But in that period, since now Jews are being destroyed and the Christians don't have that safety net, the two communities are now becoming increasingly at odds. So that by the time of the writing of John, it's a whole different animal. Illustration. If you look for the phrase, "the Jews," in Matthew, you'll only find it in the NRSV 5 times. Once when, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" It's not a derogatory term. 3 more in his arrest and crucifixion because they put the sign over his head, or Pilate is asking him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" The sign over his head, "This is the King of the Jews." Okay. Only one time might it sound a little bit like an indictment of the people when in the resurrection chapter they bribe the guards to tell the story that Jesus' disciples came and stole his body so we can quash this resurrection nonsense. And to this day, that story is still told among the Jews. Okay, but you got 5 examples, that's all. Mark, you got 6. One of them sounds similar to that last one in Matthew, for the Pharisees and all the Jews, but it's not really clear what kind of an indictment that is. All the rest of them are part of the crucifixion story. Are you the King of the Jews? This is the King of the Jews, either from Pilate or the crowd or whatever. 6 times. Luke, only 3, and all 3 occur in the story of Jesus' crucifixion. So what do we got? We got 5, 6, and 3. Watch this. 9 times John uses the phrase, "the Jews." And only 6 of them are in that, shall we say, non-indicting way, because Pilate's asking, the crowds are asking, the sign is saying. 53 times, there's far less reference to the leadership, but it's just the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. So John has seen things change because he's the last gospel. He's written towards the end of the 1st century. Some will say even into the next. Whether it was the disciple John, they argue about that. I'm not going to worry about that. Whoever was writing took his name, took his style, but clearly John is the one who has really had to wrestle with this change in scenery because of the antagonism that they're experiencing against the Jews. So, Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't see a lot of indictment of the Jewish nation as such. A little bit. But John, it's all over the place. So, I hope that answered that particular.
But that's the New Revised Standard Version, and they still kept the Jews in there.
Yeah. If you go to that Bible Gateway I mentioned one time and search for that phrase, it'll show up all those times. Not Jewish leaders, but the Jews. Yeah. Translations?
Do have Jewish leaders, don't they?
I didn't research that particular. I didn't research different translations, just the one that I've been using. So, questions about what we've been through today? I did get some more, but I got them too late to work into the study, so.
I have a silly question.
No such thing.
Well, it doesn't really matter one way or the other, but when Jesus rides in Jerusalem, is he really riding on a donkey and a colt? I mean, is he like...
You read carefully. Yes. Matthew was, of the four Gospels, Luke is the highest caliber of Greek of the four. Most educated. That's why some suggest he was a doctor. We don't know that. But Matthew wasn't cued into Hebrew poetic parallelism. In the book of Zechariah, it's a messianic prophecy about the coming of the Messiah. He will come in riding on a colt the foal of an ass, or something like that. So Matthew thinks somehow there's two animals here, and I've seen memes with a donkey with another horse on it, and then Jesus on top, or he's riding, like circus style with a foot on the back of each one. So it's just it's an example of, like, when at least Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I think, all quote John the Baptist, or the passage about John the Baptist. A voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. The Hebrew has a voice crying, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. So when it got translated from Hebrew into Greek, the Septuagint that we talked about, the Septuagint Greek version may have changed it, and that's the Bible that these guys knew to quote from. So he just wasn't a student of Hebrew poetry like he might have been. So I already gave you the handout, or talked about it.
The thing that amazes me in many books, but certainly in this one, is that it seems like the first miracle is that there's so many people who follow him, physically follow him. Because I envision so many fewer people back then, and the desert and towns spread out, and this word of mouth, no internet.
Right, no internet.
So it's like, obviously, doing miracles and unexplained things would draw people's attention, but the fact that 4,000 and 5,000, according, if you're literal, would move from whatever they were doing, drop everything, not even take food with them, and not know where they're going or when they're coming back, to me is such a miracle.
I think in Matthew, the phrase is 5,000 men. And it doesn't use the generic word for people, it uses the word men. So you could even assume greater than 5,000 if, let's just say, half of those men had a woman with them, and even a portion of them had their kids with them. That's a lot of mouths to feed. Yeah.
Did any of them show up at the crucifixion? We aren't told how many there were people there.
Yeah, and again, depending on which gospel you read, that's a good question. I would have to spend a moment researching. The movies often show a division of the house. There are those who are ready for him to die, and there are a few that are weeping over this, like the women that were part of his ministry. See, there's Jesus, then there's the executive committee, Peter, James, and John, who get to go to special stuff. Then there's the 12. And the 12 is a fluid list because if you compare the 4 Gospels and the book of Luke, you can't make the names line up. Some will say, well, Thaddeus in this book is Bartholomew in that book. That's fine. I think of it like a baseball team. There's always 9 players on the field, but on some day, Miggy doesn't play, right? But there's always 9. So I think the 12 was necessary because of the 12 tribes. But there may have been some that traded in and out. Then those are the 12. Then there are the disciples who included the women who committed the financial part of their lives to this ministry. It's clear that they supported what was going on because these guys who used to earn a living fishing weren't anymore. And then there's the crowds who were probably curious, hadn't really committed to Jesus yet, but were part of that mass that went out. If they're all going out, we're going out. Even John the Baptist, it said, all of Judea went out to him. Well, really? The whole place? I don't know. But yeah, it's compelling. Gary. I'm sorry?
They were very fickle. I mean, from Palm Sunday to Good Friday.
Yeah, and again, if you read John, which we shouldn't be mixing, but the way John has it, it's all one voice, crucify him. In fact, the most chilling moment I think maybe in the whole New Testament, is that moment. See, John's chronology of the last days is different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and he did it for a reason. Don't argue whether he's right or wrong. He's making a point. Whereas Last Supper was a Passover meal, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, clear. Not in John. Because to have a Passover meal, at noon you sacrifice the lamb, which in the Exodus story was the one that had the blood on the doors, and then that evening you had the meal. Not in John. John is Jesus is before Pilate as noon approaches on Good Friday, the day that the lambs were to be sacrificed for that evening's meal. And at the moment of sacrificing the lamb for the Passover meal, the family gathered would recite what's called the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. At noon, Pilate asks the crowd what to do with Jesus, and they respond, we have no king but Caesar. There's where John indicts the entire Jewish race. But those who are sensitive will see that as a larger indictment of humanity. Yeah, well, again, the way John tells it, nope, it's all one voice. They're all together.
Not only did they say Caesar is king, or our only king, it's that
his blood be on us and on our children. Yeah, exactly. So they indicted themselves too. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's why a lot of so-called scholars claim that's why the Jews have been so persecuted because of that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Christ killers. That terminology was rife in the Catholic Church for centuries, and not only them, and it's still out there, I'm sure. Yeah, it is really tough. It has been tough being Jewish from the beginning, no doubt. I put that up there as a request that those who are going to next week go to the food pantry, whoever wants to do it, there's a box outside my office with can openers, and there's a whole bunch of plastic bags behind the copier in Joyce's office. If somebody could grab those now or next week to take them away, Joyce will love you for it, and they want the can openers. So next week, we're going to leave Matthew, and we're going to have a little fun for the last time we're together with what's called the Christmas IQ test. You don't have to study. It's all in fun, and you won't have to write anything down. But, I'm sorry, what? It does not. Your salvation is assured. This is all just icing. And then I propose for the last lunch together that you all, if you feel so moved to do so, bring a plate of Christmas goodies to augment whatever lunch you bring, and we'll sing some carols together and have a little more fun in the other room. So we'll have a little Christmas ending to this. So, before we get to lunch, let me close with a prayer. Holy God, Matthew, one of your greatest known servants of the Word, we thank you for his insights into the life of Jesus and the way he told the Jesus story for us. What he's written in all those 28 chapters is a lifetime's worth of learning. We thank you for the opportunity to chew on a few parts in these 2 weeks. May the Great Commission be what sends us from this place, that we are to go and make disciples. In your name we pray. Amen. Lunch is in the conference room today. Feel free to walk through the fellowship hall because they're not starting for a while. When we finish, they don't mind us walking back, or we can come around outside.